In a fiery congressional showdown, Tommy Tuberville boasted he was defending principle while freezing over 300 military promotions. Then Jasmine Crockett stood holding a single letter from her Vietnam veteran father, and in an instant, the chamber went silent. Pride collapsed, the nation gasped, and millions saw power crumble live on air. What shocking words in that letter brought Tuberville to his knees. Stay with us, this is a story worth every second of your time. The U.S. Capitol was a stage set for confrontation. Under the blinding lights of a congressional hearing, cameras rolled live to millions across America. The banner read Defense Budget Oversight, but everyone in that chamber knew this was no ordinary proceeding. This was about power sacrifice and the price of arrogance. At the center sat Senator Tommy Tuberville. 69, once a football coach, now the man who had blocked hundreds of military promotions. He wore confidence like armor, believing he held the upper hand. His supporters called him principled. His critics called him reckless. Facing him was Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, a former public defender and the daughter of a Vietnam veteran. Young, sharp, and unflinching, she carried not just legal skill, but a personal history steeped in military sacrifice. The stage was set for a clash that would not just rattle Washington, it would shake the conscience of the entire nation. The room was set, the stage built, and now the story behind the clash began to unfold. What the public saw on television was a senator and a congresswoman seated across from each other. But behind that image lay months of pain and frustration. Tommy Tuberville had not just stirred a policy fight, he had set off a chain reaction that reached into kitchens, living rooms, and barracks across America. For nearly a year, Tuberville had used a Senate rule to block hundreds of military promotions. It wasn't a symbolic gesture, it was a chokehold. Generals, admirals, colonels, men and women with decades of service found their careers frozen. Families who had packed boxes for their next assignment were told to wait. Plans for retirement vanished in the fog of uncertainty. Tuberville called it leverage. To the military, it felt like sabotage. The consequences spilled out far beyond Washington. A major in Virginia delayed his retirement because his successor couldn't be confirmed. A family in Texas canceled their move when orders stalled, leaving their children without a school for the fall. In California, a Navy officer's spouse lost a job offer because the family couldn't relocate. These were not numbers on a spreadsheet. They were lives held hostage. Every stalled promotion rippled into dozens of personal losses, and still Tuberville stood firm. He leaned into microphones across cable networks, his voice steady, his words rehearsed. "I am protecting principle," he declared. "I am defending tradition." To his supporters, the line sounded strong, even noble. But inside military households, the words landed like shrapnel. A principle meant nothing when a child had no classroom, when a spouse had no paycheck, when a veteran's final ceremony was delayed indefinitely. In the chamber, some lawmakers nodded along with Tuberville's stance, but others shifted uneasily in their seats. They had read the reports. They had seen the human toll. But Tuberville thrived on defiance. He wore the anger of critics as a badge. The louder the opposition, the more confident his grin became. To him, this was politics at its sharpest draw. A line refused to move, let the country adjust. But across from him sat Jasmine Crockett, and her story was carved from a different reality. She wasn't a senator banking on sound bites. She was the daughter of Master Sergeant James Crockett, a man who had fought 3 tours in Vietnam. While Tuberville boasted about standing firm, Jasmine remembered nights when her mother sat in silence by the radio praying for news from the battlefield. She remembered the hollow sound of footsteps on the porch, wondering if it was the knock every military family feared. Her childhood was painted with the colors of sacrifice, constant relocations, half-packed boxes, and birthdays missed because her father was serving overseas. Where Tuberville saw promotions as bargaining chips, Jasmine saw them as lifelines earned through sweat, blood, and the weight of duty. She had lived the consequences even as a child. Every medal on her father's uniform came at the cost of nights she cried into her pillow. The contrast could not be sharper. Tuberville wielded principle like a weapon detached from the ground truth. Jasmine carried that truth in her bones. He claimed to defend the military by withholding its future. She embodied the military's reality through lived experience. The difference was not theoretical, it was visceral. It pulsed through every family photo in her home, every scar on her father's body. And that was the clash America tuned in to witness. On one side, a senator basking in the glow of defiance. On the other, a congresswoman whose very life story challenged his narrative. Tuberville thought he was defending the military with hard lines and political theater. But in Jasmine, Crockett sat the deeper, heavier weight of service, the kind no slogan could imitate, the kind only sacrifice could teach. Senator Tuberville thinks he's defending the troops. The narrator's voice rose, but across the table sat a woman who carried the truth of those troops in her blood. The chamber was already tense, every ear tuned to the battle about to erupt. Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, eyes locked on the senator across from her. Her voice was calm, but it cut like a knife through the silence. "Why are you turning our service members into political hostages?" The words dropped, heavy, impossible to ignore, and for a split second the room froze. Reporters raised their pens cameras, zoomed in, waiting for the strike back. This was no longer a budget hearing. It was a confrontation. Tommy Tuberville shifted in his seat, a grin spreading across his face like a dare. He didn't answer with data, didn't even flinch at the accusation. Instead, he leaned closer to the microphone, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "You've never worn a uniform, so how could you possibly understand?" The words echoed through the speakers, condescending and sharp. His allies smirked, nodding as if he had already won the exchange. The line was meant to sting, to humiliate, to remind everyone who held the senior chair. But Tuberville wasn't finished. He lifted his chin higher, letting the pause drag, before striking again. "Don't confuse a battlefield with a courtroom," he sneered. "You only know theory. I've spent my whole life around real warriors." The insult landed heavy, painting Jasmine as an outsider, a pretender who had no right to question him. To him, it was the knockout blow, the kind of line that would play well in sound bites and talk shows later that night. He wanted the room to laugh with him, to see her shrink back. And some did. A few Republican allies seated nearby chuckled their laughter, breaking the stillness like cracks in glass. The sound carried, filling the chamber with an air of mockery. It wasn't just political theater, it was personal, cruel, meant to strip Jasmine of credibility in front of the entire nation. The laughter emboldened Tuberville, his grin stretching wider, as if the game was already his. He settled back in his chair, satisfied with the spectacle he had created. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't fire back, didn't rush to defend herself against the taunts. Instead, she sat perfectly still, her face unreadable, her eyes locked on him without blinking. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was strategy. Every second she refused to react tightened the rope he had just tied around himself. The room began to shift again. What started as laughter grew awkward, thin, brittle. Viewers at home leaned closer to their screens, sensing the tension coil tighter. The congresswoman adjusted a single page in her folder, the sound of paper brushing loud against the silence. Her breathing was steady, her jaw set. She let Tuberville's words linger in the air like smoke, letting them stain him rather than her. The cameras caught the intensity in her eyes, and for a moment it felt less like a hearing and more like the stare down before a duel. She wasn't finished. She was only getting ready. Jasmine leaned forward, her voice low but cutting through the chamber like glass. "I grew up at a dinner table with an empty chair," she began, her eyes fixed on Tuberville. "Every night my mother set a plate she knew wouldn't be touched because my father was thousands of miles away serving in Vietnam. The clock on the wall ticked louder in those nights. Even as a child, I knew silence could scream." She steadied herself, her tone heavier. "I remember the radio static in our kitchen. My mother would press her ear to the speaker, praying the news wouldn't list my father's unit. On the nights it did, she would turn on the faucet, hoping I wouldn't hear her cry. But I did. I always did." Her hands tightened around her notes, but she didn't look down. "We moved so often that cardboard boxes were part of my childhood furniture. They were stacked in hallways marked with thick black ink dishes, books, winter clothes, just in case. I never unpacked fully because I knew we'd leave again. New schools, new streets, new rules. I learned not to get attached. Even birthdays weren't birthdays. They were dates scribbled in letters my father sent from halfway across the world. The chamber hung on every word." She kept her eyes locked on Tuberville. "You talk about understanding the military. Let me tell you about understanding. I went to sleep with my shoes by the bed because my mother taught me that the knock on the door could come at any hour. The knock that told families their loved one wasn't coming home. That fear lived in our house every single day. It lived in me. Her voice rose now, not in anger, but in clarity. So yes, Senator, you are right. I have never worn a uniform, but I have worn the fear. I have worn the loss. I have worn the sacrifice of a military family, and that is something you will never understand. The words landed like stone. The room fell silent, the kind of silence that pressed on the chest and slowed every breath. A camera zoomed tight on Tuberville's face. The crease in his brow deepened the smirk, thinning into strain. He adjusted his chair, but the shift only made him look smaller. Jasmine didn't wait for his reply. Her hand slid calmly into her folder, the sound of paper brushing against leather. She pulled out a sealed envelope, edges worn, names scrawled in neat handwriting. She placed it on the table, her eyes never leaving his. This, she said evenly, is from someone who did wear the uniform. Someone who gave 22 years to this country. My father. The silence inside the chamber had become unbearable, thick enough to press against the chest. Jasmine's hand moved slowly, deliberately, as she lifted the envelope from the table. Every camera in the room zoomed in lenses, focusing on the moment that had already begun to feel historic. She tore the seal with careful precision, the sound of paper ripping amplified by the microphones. The envelope opened, and she drew out several folded sheets. Her eyes scanned the first line, then she raised her voice for all to hear. This is a letter from Master Sergeant James Crockett, United States Air Force, retired. She paused, letting the words sink in, letting the weight of her father's name settle over the room. Some staffers shifted in their seats. Veterans in the gallery leaned forward. Tuberville stared, the smirk gone, replaced by a stiffness in his jaw. Jasmine unfolded the paper and began to read. I served 22 years in the United States Air Force, 3 tours in Vietnam. I carried men off battlefields, I buried friends I had trained beside, and I wrote letters to mothers who would never see their sons again. These are scars that never fade, not in body, not in memory. Service is not a slogan. It is a price that families pay in silence every single day. Her voice didn't tremble. It grew steadier with every line. The chamber was frozen. I have watched politicians stand at podiums and declare themselves champions of the troops, but too often those words were hollow. I can tell you with certainty, coaching football is not combat. Coaching football is not holding a dying man in your arms. Coaching football is not delivering a folded flag to a grieving widow. Do not confuse games with war. Do not insult sacrifice by comparing it to sport. She lifted her eyes briefly, just enough to meet Tuberville's across the chamber. His face had drained of color, his hands clenching the arms of his chair. The camera lingered on him, capturing the moment his composure cracked. Jasmine looked back to the page and continued. When you block military promotions, you are not making a point. You are turning soldiers into pawns. You are not defending principle. You are betraying the very people who swore an oath to defend this nation. These men and women do not serve politicians. They serve the country. And when you use them as bargaining chips, you weaken the very strength you claim to protect. Every sentence fell like a hammer. Phones came out and the gallery reporters scrambling to record every word. But the room itself was locked in stillness. Nobody dared interrupt. Nobody moved. Jasmine's voice filled the space, each line of her father's letter echoing off the walls. My daughter knows sacrifice because she lived it. She grew up watching her mother wait for news that I might not come home. She carried the fear of the knock at the door, the dread of uniforms bringing the worst. She understands the weight of service in a way you never will, because she bore that burden from childhood. She has lived in the shadow of war, even without wearing the uniform herself. The tension in the room was unbearable. Tuberville shifted again, his shoulders rising and falling with quick, shallow breaths. His allies glanced at him nervously, unsure whether to laugh or look away. Jasmine did not falter. She read the final lines, slowly, deliberately, each word sinking like stone into water. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett understands more about military sacrifice in her little finger than you have shown in your entire political career. That is not rhetoric. That is truth earned through blood service and loss. Signed, Master Sergeant James Crockett, United States Air Force, retired proud father. When she lowered the letter, the silence was absolute. The only sound was the hum of microphones and the clicking of cameras. Every lens swung to Tuberville, whose face had turned pale, lips pressed tight. The image of a man once so confident, now shrinking beneath the weight of a father's words, filled the screens broadcasting live across the country. This was the turning point. The smirk was gone. The swagger was gone. Jasmine had shifted the ground beneath him. For the first time, Tommy Tuberville was no longer in control. The silence after the letter didn't last. It snapped like a wire. Tuberville shoved back his chair and lurched to his feet, face-flushed voice blasting the microphones until they squealed. "This is exploiting family emotions. This is not the truth. It's theater," he shouted, jabbing a finger toward the dais, as if volume could erase what had been read. Papers fluttered on staff tables, the gavel tapped, and the gallery flinched. The stillness of a moment ago was gone, replaced by heat and noise. He pressed forward, doubling down words coming hard and fast, each one meant to bruise. "You just want to make noise. You don't care about national security," he barked, leaning into the microphone so close the metal hummed. Murmurs swelled into ripples as reporters traded quick glances and veterans in the back row stiffened. Tuberville wasn't finished, his voice flattening into a sneer as he took the lowest shot in reach. "A young girl with no experience dares to lecture me about the military." The line landed like a slap, sex and age bundled into one insult, and a few allies chuckled too loudly, trying to turn contempt into applause. The room's temperature climbed with every syllable. Sound rolled across the chamber, chair legs scraping hushed arguments, cameras whirring. But Jasmine didn't move. She sat perfectly still, eyes locked on him, expression unreadable, the quiet center of a growing storm. She let the accusations hang where they belonged, on him, not on her. One hand flattened a single page, the other hovered over a tabbed folder, steady as a metronome. Her breathing was even, her jaw set, and the red light on the nearest camera caught the small, unblinking focus in her gaze. She did not answer his provocation. She prepared her next strike, the second proof he wouldn't see coming. Slowly, she reached for a thick folder marked with bold lettering. The room seemed to contract as she flipped it open. The cameras caught every motion, every turn of the page. She spoke clearly, her voice carrying over the hum of the microphones. "What I hold in my hands," Jasmine announced, "is not a story, not a letter, not an opinion. It is a declassified Pentagon report released only weeks ago." She raised the folder so the cameras could capture the stamp on the cover, Department of Defense. Declassified. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Veterans leaned forward. Reporters scrambled to ready their cameras. Jasmine turned to the first page. "This report details the direct impact of your blockade on U.S. defense readiness," she said, each word measured. "It is not speculation. It is evidence." Her eyes flicked down to the text, then back up to the chamber. "Because of the delay in promotions, key military bases are operating without confirmed commanders. Training pipelines have been disrupted. Units that should be combat ready are stuck in limbo, and national security itself has been weakened." Her tone sharpened as she read aloud one highlighted line. "A memo from the Secretary of Defense states," and I quote, "The delay in promotions is causing severe harm to the readiness of our armed forces. Our ability to respond to threats is compromised." She set the paper flat on the table, letting the words hang in the air. It was no longer her voice, but the voice of the Pentagon, speaking directly into the record. The room erupted. Reporters fired off camera shutters in rapid bursts. Screens lit up as aides and journalists posted breaking alerts. Social media timelines filled instantly. Pentagon report confirms security risks. The hearing chamber had become a pressure cooker. What had begun as a clash of egos was now something darker, something heavier. Jasmine hadn't just countered Tuberville's insults. She had dragged his blockade into the realm of national security failure. Tuberville's face drained of color, his eyes narrowing as if trying to shrink from the page. He leaned toward the microphone, voice rough, defensive. "That's a biased assessment. A cherry-picked document," he barked. His words landed thinly unconvincing, even to those sitting beside him. He shuffled his papers, searching for footing, but the letterhead on Jasmine's folder glared back at him, undeniable. Jasmine did not hesitate. She cut him off before he could build momentum. Biased, she snapped, her voice steady as steel. "This bears the signature of the Secretary of Defense. This is an official report declassified under standard procedure. Are you suggesting the Pentagon itself is lying? Are you willing to stand here and accuse our own military of fabricating evidence? The words detonated in the chamber. Staffers exchanged wide-eyed looks. Even some of Tuberville's allies stiffened, unwilling to nod along with a claim that would pit him against the Defense Department. The senator opened his mouth, but no words came. He leaned back instead, gripping the armrests of his chair, his knuckles white. The cameras zoomed in mercilessly, broadcasting his discomfort to millions of viewers across the country. Jasmine leaned forward, pressing the advantage. You called this principle, she said, but the Pentagon calls it danger. You called this strategy. The Pentagon calls it sabotage. You claimed you were defending tradition. The Pentagon itself says you are weakening our defense. Her voice carried the rhythm of a verdict being read, each comparison a blow. This is not politics anymore, Senator. This is national security. This is the safety of every American family. The chamber was alive now, reporters scribbling, veterans nodding solemnly, the public gallery murmuring with anger and disbelief. Hashtags exploded across social media. Pentagon memo, national security at risk. Television commentators spoke over live footage, their voices strained with urgency. The story had already broken free from the hearing room and was racing across the nation. Tuberville tried once more, his voice faltering. It's being exaggerated, but the damage was done. The harder he tried to dismiss the report, the deeper he sank into contradiction. Every denial sounded weaker, smaller compared to the black and white words of the Secretary of Defense. His shoulders slumped as the realization took hold. This wasn't just about him versus Jasmine anymore. It was him versus the Pentagon. Jasmine sat back slightly, her eyes still fixed on him, unyielding. She didn't need to shout. The document in her hands had done the work for her. She had transformed the battlefield. Where Tuberville had once painted himself as a principled warrior, he now looked like a man caught undermining the very military he claimed to honor. The shift was undeniable. This was no longer framed as a partisan clash. It was the unmasking of recklessness. The crowd inside the chamber no longer saw a stubborn senator making a point. They saw the image of a leader accused of endangering America's security. And outside, millions of viewers saw it too. The chamber was still trembling from the Pentagon report when Jasmine shifted in her seat, steady hands resting on a new folder. The air was tense, reporters craning forward, veterans leaning in, allies whispering nervously. She did not rush. She waited, letting silence do its work until the room leaned toward her as if pulled by gravity. Then she spoke, voice calm but sharp. What I've shared so far is evidence from the Department of Defense. But the truth doesn't stop there. Because America's veterans, the men and women who wore the uniform, have spoken too. The words alone made Tuberville stiffen. He knew what was coming. Jasmine opened the folder and drew out a thick stack of papers bound and stamped. She held it high so the cameras could see. Bold letters covered the top page, joint statement from over 40 veterans organizations. A murmur swept the gallery. The audience recognized the names listed, respected associations with long histories, groups impossible to dismiss. Jasmine began to read. This is an open letter signed by more than 40 veteran organizations across the country. It states, and I quote, Senator Tuberville has betrayed the ideals of military service. By blocking promotions, he has undermined readiness and morale. He has turned service members into political hostages. His actions are not principle, they are poison. Gasps filled the chamber. Reporters' pens raced across notepads. Phones lit up in the gallery as staffers texted breaking alerts. But Jasmine didn't stop. She turned the page, her voice cutting through the room like steel. The letter continues. We as veterans who understand the cost of service condemn this behavior as reckless and dangerous. To treat military families as pawns is to disrespect the very oath we all once swore. The words landed like blows. Veterans seated in the chamber nodded, some folding their arms with grim satisfaction. Others whispered to each other, their faces lined with the recognition of truth. The room buzzed with a new energy, anger, yes, but also vindication. The people who had lived sacrifice were calling out the man who pretended to defend it. Jasmine lifted her head from the page. These are not politicians. These are veterans. These are Americans who wore the uniform you claim to stand for. And they call you, Senator, a betrayer of military ideals. The chamber erupted in noise. Some spectators clapped before the gavel, hammered down, others muttered under their breath. Reporters shouted questions to each other, fumbling to capture the quotes. Tuberville's face burned red. He leaned forward, gripping the microphone with both hands, veins rising in his neck. His voice exploded into the chamber. "I love this country. I love the military," he roared, slamming his palm against the desk. The microphone screeched with feedback. His words weren't steady, they cracked raw like a man cornered. "Don't you dare say I don't stand with the troops. I have spent my whole life around real warriors. Don't you dare question my loyalty." The outburst rattled the room. Aides glanced nervously at each other. A few of his allies forced applause, but the clapping died quickly in the heavy silence that followed. Tuberville's anger was loud, but it was defensive, desperate, as though volume alone could wash away the sting of 40 veteran groups calling him out. Jasmine did not flinch. She waited for the echo of his voice to fade, then leaned toward her microphone. Her words were quiet but sharp enough to cut the air. "You say you love the military, yet you have never stepped foot in uniform. You say you love the troops, yet you hold them hostage for your politics." The chamber went silent again, the contrast between her calm and his fury impossible to miss. Cameras zoomed on her face, calm, steady, resolute, then cut to him, red-faced lips, pressed tight eyes darting. The difference told the story without narration. Jasmine lifted the open letter again, letting its pages flutter under the lights. 40 veteran organizations call you reckless. They call you dangerous. They call you a betrayer of military ideals. That is not my opinion. That is their judgment. Men and women who bled for this country, who buried their brothers and sisters in uniform, now stand against you. And you cannot shout them down. The words landed heavy. Veterans in the room nodded again, one even wiping at his eye. The gavel pounded, but it couldn't drown the whispers rolling through the chamber. It was no longer just Jasmine versus Tuberville. It was Jasmine, backed by the voices of America's warriors past and present, facing a senator stripped of his pretense. Tuberville tried to speak again, but the words stuck. His lips moved, his jaw clenched, but his microphone stayed silent. The cameras stayed trained on him, capturing every twitch, every flicker of discomfort. The live feed broadcasted all a man who had shouted about loyalty, now trapped under the judgment of those who had truly served. Jasmine didn't press. She didn't need to. The letter, the veterans, the silence they had spoken louder than any accusation she could craft. Her cold reply had been enough, the final nail in his defense. The chamber was no longer laughing. The country was no longer indifferent. This was no longer theater. It was a reckoning. The chamber was no longer a place for calm procedure. It had become a battlefield. Jasmine sat steady, her shoulders squared, her eyes locked forward, while Tuberville shifted hunched and restless in his chair. The temperature in the room seemed to rise as she reached for another folder, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. She was no longer speaking as a congresswoman delivering prepared remarks. She was a prosecutor, methodical, relentless, pulling evidence from the pile in front of her and striking with each word. "Here is a record from the Defense Appropriations Office," Jasmine declared, holding up a sheet stamped with the Pentagon seal. The cameras zoomed in, capturing the numbers in black and white. "This shows that delays in promotion have cost the military over $27 million in relocation expenses. Families forced to move twice, housing contracts broken, dollars burned because one senator decided to play politics with careers." She slid the page across the desk so the gallery could see. The audience stirred, reporters scribbling furiously, staffers whispering as the gavel tapped for order. Tuberville shook his head, his hand flapping weakly in protest. "That's not fair," he muttered, but the microphones caught the crack in his voice. "Those numbers are inflated. Political spin." His words trailed into the charged air, but they carried no weight. His tone was defensive, unsteady, and the cameras caught the sheen of sweat rising on his forehead. He dabbed at it with a tissue, but the motion only made the moment worse. The once confident senator looked rattled. Jasmine did not let up. She turned another page, her voice rising in clarity. "And here is a sworn testimony from a Marine colonel whose retirement was delayed. He wrote, 'I've given 30 years to the Corps. I cannot plan my family's future because Senator Tuberville decided my career as a bargaining chip.'" She looked directly at Tuberville. That's not politics. That's pain. Real families, real lives broken because of one man's blockade. Tuberville scrambled through his own papers as if searching for a lifeline. He stammered, "I never meant to target families-only policy." But his voice faltered, the words brittle. The gallery stirred with murmurs. Jasmine's expression did not change. She simply moved on, opening another file. "And here is the readiness report from Fort Hood." She continued, her voice even sharper now. "Command delayed. Training schedules disrupted. Units left without certified leadership. This is what your blockade has created." She raised the page high, the bold text visible to the lenses trained on her. "A hollowed chain of command in one of America's largest bases." Tuberville gripped his microphone, his knuckles white, and snapped, "This is exaggerated." His voice cracked again, higher than before. "People always find a way." But the denial rang hollow. The words were louder, yes, but they carried no conviction. Jasmine answered with the calm of someone holding the truth in her hands. "Exaggerated?" she asked coldly. She flipped to another file and read, "Testimony from military spouses. Wives and husbands who quit jobs, who lost income because relocation orders were frozen. Dozens of families scraping by on credit cards waiting for promotions that never came. Do you call that exaggerated? Tell them it's exaggerated." The gavel pounded as the gallery erupted in noise. Reporters lifted cameras. Veterans shook their heads, some muttering under their breath. Tuberville was sweating heavily now, his collar damp, his lips trembling as he tried to form a response. The cameras zoomed in mercilessly, capturing his unraveling in close detail. The man who had laughed earlier in the day was gone. In his place stood a cornered politician, his image collapsing live on air. Out in the press gallery, the reporters were already typing. Tweets flew across timelines, Tuberville sweating, Tuberville stumbling Crockett, commanding the room. News tickers flashed with updates. Television anchors cut in with live commentary. The senator appears rattled. Congresswoman Crockett is controlling the exchange. Jasmine was not done. She lifted another document. And here, straight from the Pentagon, an email chain dated July, she said, her tone sharper still. "Commanders warning that stalled promotions are leaving combat units leaderless." One line reads, and I quote, "We are playing roulette with national security." She let the words echo, her eyes fixed on Tuberville's pale face. "Roulette, Senator. That's what your blockade has done." The words hit like thunder. Reporters gasped. Veterans in the room stiffened. Tuberville's mouth opened, then closed. He blinked rapidly as if searching for a reply, but no reply came. He leaned back in his chair, one hand wiping sweat from his temple, the other clutching crumpled notes. He tried again, leaning toward the microphone with forced bravado. "This is just political theater," he said hoarsely. "I'm standing by my principles." But even as the word left his mouth, his voice cracked, the syllables drawn thin. The word principles sounded less like a defense and more like a plea. Jasmine's answer was immediate and cold. "Principles," she asked, her voice sharp as glass. "Principles do not force children out of schools. Principles do not bankrupt families. Principles do not gamble with combat readiness. What you call principle, the Pentagon calls danger. What you call conviction, America sees as chaos." The chamber was no longer divided. The mood was clear. Reporters were scribbling furiously. Commentators were nodding. Veterans were leaning forward with grim approval. The once smug senator was unraveling live, while the congresswoman across from him remained unshaken, steady as a stone. The contrast was absolute. Television cameras cut tight on Tuberville's face. The sweat was rolling down his cheek now, his lips quivering, his jaw twitching as he tried to hold composure. It was a portrait of collapse broadcast to millions. Every stammer, every tremble, every flicker of panic was captured and streamed into living rooms across America. Social media amplified the moment instantly. "Tuberville has failed completely," one reporter typed. "Crockett is commanding the battlefield." Another wrote, "The senator looks like a man cornered." Screens filled with images, the congresswoman poised and strong, the senator sweating and shrinking. The hearing room had turned into a courtroom, and America was the jury. The evidence piled high, undeniable, devastating. Tuberville's voice grew weaker with each attempt to defend himself. "I love this country," he said at one point, his voice breaking. I love the military. But even those words, once his shield, now rang hollow because his actions stood against them. Jasmine did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. She simply let the evidence speak. Let the images of his collapse carry the truth. A man who had mocked her, who had laughed at her, now sat red-faced and broken, drowning in sweat while she stood as the unflinching voice of the families he had harmed. The commentators on live television framed it bluntly. This is not a debate. This is a reckoning. Another voice added, Tuberville's career may not survive what just happened. The contrast could not be missed. He had entered the chamber as an arrogant politician, laughing, dismissing, sneering. Now he sat as a defeated man, exposed, humiliated. She had entered as the daughter of a veteran, carrying quiet dignity. Now she stood as the voice of moral authority, her strength undeniable, her composure unshaken. The American people saw it all. They saw the sweat dripping from his forehead, the stammer in his voice, the collapse of his facade. They saw the steady fire in her eyes, the calm in her voice, the precision of her evidence. They saw the clash of arrogance against authenticity, and they saw arrogance fall. By the time the exchange ended, the chamber was no longer the same. Reporters were already shaping headlines, Tuberville defeated, Crockett ascends. Veterans were whispering that justice had been done. Staffers whispered that they had never seen such a collapse in a hearing room before. The nation was not just watching politics. They were witnessing a moral collapse. A powerful senator stripped of his mask, a young congresswoman rising as the voice of honor. It was no longer about promotions or policy or even partisanship. It was about truth sacrifice and the reckoning of a man who thought he could mock it all. The chamber held its breath as Jasmine closed her folder. The battle was over, but the image would live on: one leader broken under the weight of his own arrogance, and another standing unshaken, carrying the honor of those who had served. America would remember which one spoke for them. The hearing was over, but its shockwaves had only just begun to spread. Outside the chamber, cameras swarmed, reporters shouting questions, the buzz of media vans filling the Capitol steps. Across Washington, the newsrooms scrambled to rewrite their evening broadcasts. Headlines shifted in real time. This was no longer a story about a budget fight or military promotions. It was the story of a senator brought low and a congresswoman who had stood unflinching, her father's words echoing across the nation. The verdict of the public was already forming before the gavel had even struck the final time. Within hours, statements poured in from veterans organizations. The American Legion released a statement declaring Congresswoman Crockett's defense of military families today was not only courageous, it was necessary. The veterans of foreign wars echoed the sentiment, we stand with her words. Military promotions should never be pawns in political games. Smaller groups representing Marines, Army families, Air Force retirees all followed in chorus. By nightfall, more than 30 organizations had spoken, and by the next morning, the number had climbed to over 40. The unity was stunning. Veterans who often disagreed on policy or politics were speaking with one voice. Jasmine Crockett had defended them, and Senator Tuberville had betrayed them. In kitchens and living rooms across America, military families began writing letters. Some were formal, typed on crisp stationery, signed by spouses who had endured decades of moves and deployments. Others were handwritten, scrawled in ink, filled with raw emotion. A sergeant's wife in North Carolina wrote, "For months we felt invisible. Tonight we felt seen." A retired colonel from Kansas sent a note, "You honored every sacrifice my family ever made. Thank you for standing tall when so many stayed silent." Each letter carried the same refrain: gratitude, recognition, and the relief of finally hearing their struggles spoken aloud in the halls of power. Meanwhile, Tuberville's office went dark. His staff shut the doors, phone lines jammed with angry calls, reporters gathering outside like a siege. The senator's allies tried to offer spin, but their words were drowned in the flood. Editorials turned on him overnight. Conservative outlets called his performance a stumble. Liberal commentators labeled it a collapse. By morning, the consensus had hardened, his credibility was shattered. Donors hesitated. Party leaders whispered that his future in committees might be over. The man who once walked tall in defiance now found himself cornered, his arrogance transformed into political isolation. Far from the Capitol, in a modest living room in Ohio, an old veteran sat alone with his television. His hair was silver, his hands gnarled from years of labor, his back bent with age. As Jasmine's voice replayed on the evening news reading her father's letter, his body trembled. He reached for a worn photo of his platoon men lost decades ago, and the tears broke loose. He whispered through the sobs. Finally, someone said it. Finally. The camera in Washington had moved on, but in that small room, history had reached deep into a veteran's heart and cracked it open. In another home, a young military family decided to record a video on their phone. The father, a captain awaiting promotion, sat beside his wife, with their two small children climbing in and out of the frame. His voice was quiet but firm. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said, "you spoke for us today. You spoke for every soldier waiting, for every spouse holding everything together, for every child who doesn't understand why life is on pause. You spoke for us," his wife added through tears. "You gave us hope." The clip spread quickly online, shared thousands of times, a living testament that her words had broken through. The media captured the moment with relentless clarity. The defining moment of Jasmine Crockett's career, one anchor declared, her tone almost reverent. "We have seen political takedowns before, but nothing with this kind of moral clarity." Newspapers ran front-page images of Jasmine, her father's letter in hand, her gaze unwavering. Side by side, another photo showed Tuberville, his face pale, sweat dripping down his cheek, his eyes darting away from the cameras. The juxtaposition was brutal and unforgettable: dignity versus collapse, truth versus arrogance. Behind the curtain, staffers whispered about the energy shift. "You could feel it," one aide said. The second she read that letter, the power in the room flipped. It wasn't his anymore. It was hers. Lobbyists who once circled Tuberville for influence now pulled back, wary of being tainted by his humiliation. Political rivals sharpened their knives, sensing weakness. Allies avoided his calls, unwilling to defend a man who had become a national symbol of reckless pride. As the dust settled, all eyes returned to the chamber itself. The cameras had caught the final scene with cinematic precision. Jasmine rose from her chair, gathering her papers with calm hands, the letter from her father resting on top. She pressed it to her chest for a moment, a gesture subtle but powerful, and then turned to leave. The gallery erupted into applause, clapping cheers, the sound of approval that thundered through the chamber. The gavel tried to quiet it, but the sound refused to die. It rolled over the wood panels, down the corridor, spilling into the cameras, still broadcasting live. Tuberville remained seated. His head lowered, his shoulders slumped, his hands gripping the edge of the desk, as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. He did not clap. He did not move. His eyes stared downward, fixed on nothing, while the applause swelled around him. The contrast was perfect for the cameras, one figure standing tall, leaving with grace, while the other sat broken, isolated, a man stripped of his power in front of the entire nation. The applause followed Jasmine all the way out of the chamber, echoing in the marble halls of the Capitol. Reporters trailed her microphones thrust forward, but she walked steadily, her expression calm, her father's letter still in her hand. In that moment, she was not just a congresswoman. She was the voice of every soldier's family, every veteran who had carried the burden, every American who believed service should never be cheapened. And the nation knew it. By nightfall, the story was cemented. Networks replayed the final images on loop. Editorials praised her composure. Commentators debated what it meant for her future. But the common thread was clear. This was not just a political moment. It was moral theater, raw and undeniable, that would be remembered for years to come. Jasmine Crockett had delivered more than arguments. She had delivered a reckoning. And in the still-frame broadcast across the country, the congresswoman walking tall, the letter of a veteran in her hand, the sound of applause chasing her steps, while the senator sat frozen. His head bowed in defeat. The message could not have been clearer. One career had been defined. Another had been destroyed. And America, breathless, had witnessed every second of it. From the thunder of applause and the weight of silence that followed, the lesson came into sharp focus. The cameras had stopped their relentless zooms, the microphones had settled back into their stands, and the room seemed to breathe again. What remained was not a headline or a soundbite, but a truth so clear it felt carved into stone. No one needed a replay to understand it. No one needed a commentator to explain it. The meaning stood on its own, heavy and undeniable. Truth did not arrive dressed in armor or backed by a chorus of slogans. It arrived in paper and ink, in a father's steady handwriting, in a voice that did not shake when it read the words aloud. It arrived without theatrics, without a raised fist, without a threat. It walked into that chamber the way a veteran walks into a quiet morning, upright, disciplined, impossible to ignore. It did not need to win the argument. It only needed to be heard. And once it was heard, the room changed. A letter did what speeches could not. It slipped past defenses and cut through rehearsed lines. It did not shout. It resonated. It did not accuse. It testified. Each sentence carried a memory. Each memory carried a cost. And each cost asked a simple question: what do we owe to those who served? The answer was not found in volume or rank, but in the plain weight of a life lived under duty. In that answer lay the power that disarmed the bluster sitting across the table. The louder arrogance tried to speak, the smaller it became under the weight of lived experience. Studio lights could not polish it. Talking points could not rescue it. The letter did not argue, it revealed. And revelation is the one thing that cannot be shouted down, because revelation belongs to what happened to who was there, to what was carried home in silence. The nation felt it in the same way the chamber felt it. Kitchens and living rooms went quiet, not out of fear, but out of recognition. People who knew the shape of sacrifice by the shadows on their walls understood what they were seeing. They did not need anger to guide them. They needed clarity, and they got it. A truth told plainly held in the hands of a daughter became more powerful than any podium. The broadcast carried it, but the meaning carried itself. There is a kind of strength that does not flex. It does not perform. It stands and endures, and when the time comes, it speaks. That strength was in the ink in the folds of paper, in the pauses between lines. It was in the memory of men carried off fields in the ache of names, read to mothers in the quiet rooms where a clock ticks louder because someone is not home. That strength did not try to defeat a man. It reminded a nation of what it believes about honor. When truth is this clean, it reorganizes a room. It changes who is listening and why they listen. It turns a debate into a mirror. It asks the proud to measure themselves against the standard they claim to defend. That was the shift everyone felt, and few could name the standard had returned, and it did not ask permission to enter. It sat down and waited to be recognized, and when it was, the noise lost its footing. The image that lingered was simple: a letter held steady in two hands and a voice that did not waver while reading it. No contempt, no jeer, no rush. The tempo of conviction is not frantic, it is exact. It moves with the confidence of something tested and found true. And when it finished speaking, the room learned what silence is, for not for fear, but for respect. In that respect there was a reckoning, not the kind that ruins for sport, but the kind that restores scale. The scale said service weighs more than slogans. It said families carry more than talking points. It said leadership is measured not by how loudly one stands in the spotlight, but by how well one stands under the burden of duty. A paper folded in thirds outweighed a tower of speeches. The cameras would later call it a defining moment because they are trained to name what they cannot fully hold. But the moment defined itself before anyone described it. It defined itself when the letter said what no spin could unsay. It defined itself when the room learned that quiet can be sharper than thunder. It defined itself when America remembered that truth does not need force to be felt. It needs courage to be told. Courage took a simple form that day. It did not slam a fist. It did not dare an opponent. It lifted a page, it met a gaze, it spoke the words, and it let those words do the work. That is the oldest kind of courage we have, the kind that believes reality will stand up under the light. It did. And because it did, those who had leaned on noise found themselves with nothing to lean on at all. There will be other hearings, other speeches, other storms that try to drown meaning beneath volume, but what happened in that room will remain a map for anyone who wants to know the way back. The way back is not through sharper insults or stronger spin. The way back is through proof that bears the mark of lived cost. It is through the stories that do not demand belief so much as invite conscience. Conscience, once invited, does not forget how to arrive. That is why the silence spread, why it felt heavier than applause. Applause celebrates. Silence consecrates. The letter did not ask to be celebrated. It asked to be taken seriously, and the silence answered. In that answer, pride lost its cover. In that answer, a nation remembered its measure. In that answer, a certain kind of politics failed to breathe. The final line belongs where it began, in a voice that refuses to dress truth in anything it does not need. The fight had roared and the headlines had formed, but the message did not change its clothes to meet them. It stayed what it was from the start, plain and immovable. And when it was spoken, it did what force could not do. It gathered a country around a single, undeniable point. Truth needs no gun. One letter is enough to make America fall silent. The hearing had ended, the gavel had struck, but the echo of the moment refused to die. It lingered in the chamber, in the hallways of the Capitol, and the news broadcasts replaying the footage. And from that echo, a lesson began to take shape, one not just for politicians, but for the entire country. People weren't only talking about who won or who lost. They were asking themselves what it all meant. What does service really mean? What does sacrifice demand of those who claim to lead? And what happens when arrogance is forced to stand in the light of truth? The first part of the lesson was about the power of silence. Jasmine Crockett never needed to raise her voice. She never had to shout down the senator across from her. She didn't slam her fist or drown him in insults. She did something more devastating. She let the evidence, the letter, the lived reality speak for her. When she finished reading her father's words, the chamber fell silent. That silence was louder than any jeer, more final than any gavel. The lesson was unmistakable: truth does not need volume. Truth carries its own gravity. That is why the silence spread. It was not the silence of indifference. It was the silence of recognition. In that silence, even those who had come in ready to dismiss her felt the weight of what she carried. The lesson told itself: when truth is spoken plainly and courageously, it doesn't need force. It doesn't need spectacle. It needs only to be heard. And once it is heard, it changes the air around it. The second part of the lesson was about authenticity versus arrogance. Tuberville had walked into that chamber with swagger. He laughed, he mocked, he sneered. He wore arrogance like a suit of armor. But arrogance is brittle. When confronted with authenticity, letters written in sacrifice, documents signed by generals, testimonies from families, his armor cracked. Sweat rolled down his forehead, his lips trembled, his words stumbled. The cameras did not need commentary. They showed the collapse of a man who had built his power on posturing, and they showed the rise of a woman whose strength came from lived experience. For Jasmine, the authenticity was not strategy, it was inheritance. It came from nights spent watching her mother cry quietly by a radio, from birthdays spent without her father, from the constant fear of the knock at the door. It came from carrying those memories into adulthood and finally giving them voice. That authenticity struck deeper than any insult. It turned the hearing into a mirror, forcing everyone to ask who really understands service, who really carries sacrifice. The lesson was not confined to politics. It reached into homes across America. Veterans who had carried the weight of silence for decades felt something break open inside them. Spouses who had moved from base to base recognized their own lives in her words. Children of service members, now grown adults, remembered the boxes, the empty chairs, the sound of absence. They understood instantly what she meant when she said, "I have worn the fear." The country saw it too, and in that recognition, the lesson spread wider. One old veteran put it best. Sitting in his living room, medals hanging dusty on the wall, he whispered to no one in particular. Finally, someone said it. His tears were not just for Jasmine's father. They were for his own brothers buried decades ago, for the nights he couldn't sleep, for the times politicians used him as a prop. The human lesson is that truth once spoken can heal. It can reach wounds left unattended. It can restore dignity to people who thought they'd been forgotten. The families who recorded thank you messages reinforced the same point. A captain with his children climbing into his lap looked into a phone camera and said, "You spoke for us today," his wife added through tears. "You gave us hope." They didn't use policy language. They didn't talk about readiness reports. They talked about hope. And that is what truth provides when it is spoken from the right place in the right way. The lesson was that dignity doesn't just silence arrogance. It gives strength to the forgotten. The broader public also took notice. A teacher in Michigan told her students the next morning, "This is why we study civics, to see what happens when power faces truth." A truck driver in Georgia called into a radio show and said, "That woman stood for us. She showed that one piece of paper can be stronger than 1,000 speeches." A nurse in California wrote online, "I've never been in the military, but I've waited for news about people I love." She carried that fear for all of us. Each reaction was personal, emotional, and tied to the same human lesson when you speak truth. Born of sacrifice, people feel it in their bones. The political world spun in its usual frenzy. Headlines screamed about humiliation and victory. Commentators debated the fallout for Tuberville's career. But beneath all that noise, ordinary Americans were carrying a quieter, more profound message. This was not just politics. This was a moral reckoning. The lesson was that leadership is not measured by age, rank, or bluster. It is measured by the weight of what you carry and the courage with which you share it. Jasmine's father had given her the words, but she gave them to the nation. That is where the deepest lesson rests. Courage is contagious. One man who had lived through war passed his truth to his daughter. She carried it into a chamber built for theater and turned it into a courtroom of conscience. And when she did, millions who had been silent found themselves nodding, whispering, crying, speaking again. Courage multiplies when it is seen. The final words of the lesson were etched in memory. Truth needs no gun. One letter is enough to make America fall silent. That was not hyperbole. That was history captured in real time. A simple piece of paper carried by steady hands stripped arrogance bare and restored honor to those who had given everything. It proved that truth told plainly can shake a nation more than any outburst of power. The human lesson is that sometimes the strongest weapon is not force, but memory. The story will live on in broadcasts, in textbooks, in conversations between generations. But its lasting power will not come from analysis. It will come from the silence people felt when they heard the truth spoken. Silence that consecrates. Silence that says this matters. Silence that teaches louder than applause ever could. That is the silence of conscience, and it is the lesson America took home that day. And as Jasmine walked out of the chamber, her father's letter in hand, the applause thundering behind her, the lesson carried itself with her. It told the country what arrogance had forgotten and what sacrifice never let go of service. Is sacred, truth is powerful, and dignity will always outlast swagger. That was the human lesson, and it will not be forgotten. And now comes the part that matters, what we do with it. The truth landed. The room went quiet. The lesson is clear. Silence without action is just another audience, and we are done being spectators. This is the moment you turn a story into a standard. If service is sacred, rang true to you, then let your voice move like a signal flare. Decide here and now that you will not let sacrifice be used as a prop again. Start where power listens, your representatives. Call, email, and show up at town halls. Look them in the eye and say, end the political blockades that hold military families hostage. Ask for timelines, not talking points. Demand protections for promotions, housing stability for base moves, school continuity for kids, and real support for spouses' jobs. Tell them, vote on policy, not on the backs of soldiers' families. Put their answers in writing, and if they dodge, post it so your neighbors can see. Build a chorus the noise can't drown out. Share the clip, share the letter, share the facts that broke the room open. Host a listening night for veterans at your church, union hall, or local library. Let their stories set the agenda. If you lead a business, hire military spouses and guard their flexibility like armor. If you coach a team, teach your players that leadership is service, not swagger. Donate to veteran organizations that help with relocation shocks, legal aid for orders gone sideways, and counseling when the quiet gets too heavy. Turn outrage into oversight. Track the votes, not the slogans. Bookmark the roll calls and check who stood with families when it counted. Register to vote, verify your registration, and bring 2 friends with you when you cast a ballot. Volunteer for campaigns that treat service as a promise, not a prop. When a leader sneers at live, sacrifice, answer with numbers, names, and the line that silenced a chamber. Tell them you work for us and we stand with those who stood for all of us. Make a simple pledge and keep it. I will not be quiet when military families are used as leverage. Tape it to your fridge, your locker, your dashboard. Say it to your kids so they learn the difference between power and honor. Say it to your friends so they remember that courage multiplies when it is seen. And when someone asks what one person can do, hand them the proof, a letter that didn't raise its voice and still shook a nation. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything, like subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.